The first setting we will take a look at is allocated RAM. Allocated RAM is more of an unofficial setting that you can change inside the launcher of the game to allocate more or less RAM to Minecraft. As a standard, it's set to 2 GB for me, and I think it'll also be from most people playing this game, but if you don't have that much RAM, it might be set to something lower. I've tested this both with the 2 GB, 4, 8 and 16 GB of RAM allocated to Minecraft. It's important that you restart the launcher after you have changed the allocated RAM for the game. If you simply press play after you have changed and press save, it won't actually save the changes you have made. So you have to restart the launcher, open it up again, and then you can play with the changes made to the allocated RAM. This is only a thing you have to do for the first time you change it, and after that it will remember the amount of RAM that you have changed it to. In my examples, you can see just how much RAM the game is actually using, because it will in some cases use more than is allocated and in other cases use a lot less. For my recommendation for this more unofficial setting, I recommend that you set this to half the amount of RAM you have. So if you have 16 GB of RAM, I recommend you set this to 8. If you have 8 GB of RAM, I recommend you set this to 4 and so on. If you don't know how much RAM you have, you can always open up the task manager and see it under the performance tab. Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my video. Today we are taking a look at Minecraft, the Java version, where we'll take a look at all the different settings, how to compare in terms of FPS and fidelity, and lastly I'll show my own optimized settings that I recommend. If you have any suggestions for future games you would like for me to analyze, feel free to write them in the comments below. Before we go into the specific settings, I want to showcase the two extremes of all low and all ultra to see both the performance but also the quality difference between the two. However, in this game it is even more of an extreme difference between the two than usual, which mainly comes down to the difference in the render distance, which has a profound effect on the performance of the game, as you can see. There is a few points I want to mention before we move on to the next setting. Firstly, the in-game frame rate limiter is bad. It's causing frame time stutters and you should therefore use an external one instead, if you are going to cap your FPS. That could be the one provided by Nvidia or Rivertuna statistics server. Secondly, Minecraft can be a very difficult game to test because the FPS will fluctuate a lot even when you are standing still and have been standing still for several minutes. Therefore my test won't always be 100% accurate. As you can see in this video, there is a ridiculous 95% difference between all low and all ultra. So we definitely have a lot of headroom we can work with. So let's get started. Biome blend determines how well two different biomes will blend together when you're running around in Minecraft. As you can see here in my example, while we have this set to off, there's a harsh line between the two biomes where you can see which blocks are part of which biome. As we turn this slider up, they will more and more blend together until lastly at 15 × 15 you can't actually see anymore which blocks are part of which biome. In my testing, I could not find any performance difference whatsoever between any of these settings. I also did not see any difference in my CPU usage, GPU usage or my VRAM. Therefore, I would just recommend to set this to 15 × 15 to get the best quality, since it doesn't seem to affect your FPS whatsoever. Now let's take a look at graphics. Graphics determines the quality of the different graphics inside the game. Under this setting we have 3 options to choose from, either fast, fancy or fabulous. Fast will reduce the amount of snow and rain, and you will also lose that transparency effect on the leaves, as you can see we have on either fancy or fabulous. Fancy is supposed to be a balance between FPS and quality. And lastly, fabulous, I'm not quite sure what you actually get there. I couldn't find any noticeable difference between that and fancy, so I'm not sure what you lose that extra performance for. Therefore, I would highly recommend to use fancy because, like it says, it is a really good balance between FPS and quality. Next up we got smooth lighting. Smooth lighting is basically the same as ambient occlusion. So smooth lighting will add some extra soft shadows into different crevices in the game. The best example of that is around the different blocks in the game, because those all have small crevices where the two different blocks meet each other. This means that this setting will add a lot of shadows to the game, but also remove a lot of shadows if you turn it off. So the game will look very weird and very bright when you have it turned off. You can also see that it also smoothens out the shadows beneath the trees, for example, where while we have it turned off, it's very harsh square shadow, where it seems more realistic and more smoothed out on either minimum or maximum. Between minimum and maximum, I had a really tough time finding any differences. Therefore, I would highly recommend to use minimum, as it seems to have around the same performance as having it turned off, while looking a lot better than having it turned off. Now let's take a look at mid-map levels. Mid-mapping is a technique used in computer graphics where an image or a texture is pre-downscaled, so the less has to be rendered, and there is a smoother image. Because you have to render less, this will also in turn improve your performance of the game. So you can see here in my example, I got around 5% performance improvement from enabling mid-map levels. It doesn't seem to be that much of a difference between the different mid-map levels in terms of both visually but also in terms of performance. So if you enable it, you might as well go all the way up to 4. If you just look at it at the regular distance, it can be quite difficult to actually see the difference. But if I zoom in 300%, you can see that the textures here on the cobblestone has gotten a lot smoother on while we have mid-mapping enabled compared to while we have it turned off. This makes the textures at a distance look a lot better and a lot smoother, like I said. And since it also improves your performance, I highly recommend to set this to 4. Next up, we have the distortion effects. The distortion effects are only affected by either when you're traveling through portals in the game, so that could be, for an example, the nether portal, or when you have the nausea effect on you. While you have this set to off or at a low percentage, you will only get a green halo around your screen while you're either traveling to a portal or having the nausea effect. As you go higher, you'll get more and more distortion until you get all the way up to 100%, where you can see that we have a lot of distortion on the image and it can actually be difficult to walk around. Some people might find that effect nauseating in real life and therefore would want to turn it down. This is more of a personal preference because even though it can affect your performance, it's only when you're affected by these distortion effects, and that will only happen rarely. Next up, we have FOV effects. FOV effects will affect two different things in the game. Firstly, it will affect the effects you can see in the bottom left and bottom right corners of the screen when you're starting to run or when you stop running, and also actually while you are running. So if you turn FOV effects all the way down to off, you will also turn that effect off. Secondly, it will also affect how much of the FOV you have set in the game. In my example, that is an FOV of 80. You will actually be able to see. So you can see here in my example, I'm scrolling through the different FOV effects, and you can see as I go higher in the FOV effects, I'll also be able to see more of the screen. Therefore, you kinda need to have this at 100% if you want to get the full advantage of the FOV you have set in the game. However, it does also come with a performance cost, especially while you're running, because it has to render that effect. But I definitely feel like it's worth it to have it 100% because otherwise you might as well just lower your FOV because you're not gonna get the full potential of it unless you set it to 100%. Next up, we have render distance. Render distance determines how far away the world will render in. This therefore also has the biggest impact on performance, with an up to 70% difference in performance between having this on 4 chunks and having it all the way up to 24 chunks. With those two things in mind, it can be quite difficult to make one recommendation for everyone because it will really depend on the kind of PC you have. One thing I do want to mention is that the higher you go, the more your CPU has to do. So if you do not have that good of a CPU, I would recommend to keep this at a lower setting. For this setting, I would recommend to try to aim for the 3 in the middle, so either 8, 12 or 16 chunks. Next up, we have view bobbing. View bobbing will determine whether or not the camera will move while you are moving around in the world. This will make it seem more realistic and actually seem like you're actually running around. While you have this disabled, it looks like you're just basically hovering around the map. Since this has no impact on performance, this is more of a personal preference, but I would definitely recommend to leave it on because the game just looks weird without it. Now let's take a look at clouds. Clouds determines whether or not clouds itself are enabled and in what quality. Under this setting we have 3 options to choose from, either off, fast or fancy. Since there's barely any difference in performance, but a big difference in quality, I would recommend to leave this at fancy, because it's gonna make the game look a lot better and you're not gonna really notice the 2 to 3% performance drop. Next up we got particles. Particles determines the quality of the different particles in the game. So that will be the particles coming from the smoke, or when it's raining, or when it's snowing. However, in my testing I did not find any quality difference between the 3 different options, even though we did see a 9% performance difference between the 3 different options. Therefore, I would just recommend to leave this at decrease and save the extra performance. Now let's take a look at entity shadows. Entity shadows determines whether or not the different entities in the game will have a shadow. So the different animals and other living entities in the game. As you can see, this has a very small impact both on the visual but also on performance. I could see a scenario where you have a very large farm with a lot of animals where it might make a performance difference. But otherwise, I don't expect it to make any noticeable difference. Therefore, I would just recommend to leave this on. And lastly, we have entity distance. Entity distance determines how far away the different entities will load in. So the different mobs and the different animals. This is a setting you need to align with your render distance, because if your render distance is not high enough, you won't be able to see the entities anyways, and there's no reason to have your entity distance set up to the highest. Therefore, I have done a bit of detective work and figured out what the different entity distance options are and how they compare to the render distance options. So if you take a look at 50%, that is more or less equivalent to around 8 chunks. 100% is to 12 chunks, 150 is to 18, 200 is to 24, and lastly 300 is to 32. So even though you can go up to 500% in entity distance, it doesn't make any sense because you're limited to your render distance at 32 chunks. Therefore, I also definitely recommend that you align these two settings. Figure out what render distance you want what option you want your render distance to be at, and then align that with the entity distance. Here are my own recommended settings, which are based off the recommendations I've made throughout the video. Here it is important to mention that I chose 12 chunks for my recommended settings, but you should adapt this setting to your PC. Furthermore, because I chose 12 chunks, I have also chosen 100% in entity distance. It is important to match your entity distance setting with the render distance setting. If you can't remember the connections between these two settings, go back in the video and watch me explain it. And here is the live showcase of my recommended settings put together. As you can see, the game still looks great and we're able to see pretty far out in the distance. When I stack this up against all low and all ultra, you can see we have the same quality as all ultra, though we do lose some render distance, but since we gain around 93% performance compared to all ultra, I would definitely say it's worth it. We do also have around a 65% lower FPS than all low, but our settings look a lot better and we are actually able to see where we are going and actually be able to spot things out in the distance. And therefore I would also say that's definitely worth it. But thank you all for watching. If you made it this far and been able to use this video to get better FPS in Minecraft, please like and subscribe for future videos where we will take a look at other games. If you have any feedback on the videos or any other tips or tricks to get more FPS in Minecraft, please share them in the comments below. If you're interested in these kinds of videos, maybe check out the video I made on Rust or Valheim. Have a nice day. Bye bye.